"Get out, old lady. We don't cater to begging black grandmas here," Deputy Victor Cargill sneered, crushing a water bottle in his hand like he was squeezing the dignity out of her. No warning, no hesitation, he flung the ice-cold water straight into Samatha Carter's face, a mother who simply came to ask about her son. He thought she was weak, helpless, just another black woman to humiliate. What he didn't know? She's the mother of Sheriff Bryan. That filthy splash wasn't just an insult. It lit the fuse to a firestorm that would burn Ridgepoint's rotten system to ash. What state are you in? If this happened to your family, would you stay quiet or bring the whole damn house down? That morning, the sky over Ridgepoint was neither sunny nor rainy, covered by a thin layer of gray clouds, enough to make people feel cold despite the absence of wind. Mrs. Samatha Carter stepped down from bus route number 4, slowly adjusting the faded collar of her pale purple blouse. That shirt was an old gift from her son Brian on his birthday 3 years earlier. She carried nothing but a small bag and patience. It had been many months since she last saw her son. Recent calls lasted only a few minutes, scattered with phrases like, "I'm very busy, Mom." She did not blame him, only wanted to see her son in person. Now the sheriff of all Ridgepoint County, to see how the mischievous boy had grown, living amid power and pressure. The Ridgepoint County Police Headquarters stood in the administrative area, a 3-story building painted cold white, its facade neat but lifeless. The automatic glass door opened as she approached. Inside, the air seemed to cut off completely the street noise, a kind of office silence, orderly, cautious, and vigilant. She walked in. The worn heels of her shoes made soft clicking sounds on the cold tile floor. A few officers passed by, none paying attention to the gray-haired woman moving with a gaze both strange and familiar. She noticed the scent of paperwork mixed with cold coffee in the air, and a new poster hung on the wall. Seriousness, discipline, community service. She slowly walked along the main corridor toward the administrative area, where a low wooden counter and some waiting chairs stood. Behind the counter, a man bent over a pile of papers. He wore a pale beige uniform, with a metal name tag hung crookedly on his chest. Cargill. She approached with a small, polite smile. "Hello, I want to see Sheriff Carter, my son. May I wait here?" Deputy Victor Cargill looked up. His face was not old, but had wrinkles between his brows, eyes cold and watery as if sleep-deprived. He looked her up and down with a hostile gaze, as if she were a troublesome citizen mistakenly entering a restricted area. "Do you have an appointment?" His voice was even but unfriendly. She shook her head, still smiling gently. "I just want to ask about my son a little, if it's not a bother." Victor did not answer immediately. He muttered something to a colleague behind him, then returned with an even colder expression. Victor glanced at the gray-haired woman behind the counter. No papers, no appointment. Dressed simply, speaking softly. In his eyes, she was just some confused old woman trying to access authorities to complain about meaningless things. "I asked already. Do you have an appointment?" he repeated, his voice higher and edged with irritation. Samatha hesitated briefly, but kept her steady tone. "I am Brian Carter's mother. I just want to see my son a little." Upon hearing the name Brian, Victor's expression froze for a second. Then he smirked, eyes full of suspicion. "What did you say? The sheriff's mother? Who proves that? Anyone can say that." Samatha tried to reach for documents in her bag, but Victor interrupted. "No one is allowed in this area without a valid reason. And please, how could a black person come here? Don't lie." She furrowed her brows slightly. His voice, his eyes, every word felt like an insult. She did not get angry. Not because she was weak, but because she had lived through years when a wrong glance was enough to make a black woman disappear from the community. But this silence made Victor feel challenged. "Get out, old lady. No sentimental stories here," he said clearly, louder, deliberately for those nearby to hear. A few officers farther away glanced back. A female staff member stopped typing. The whole hall seemed to freeze. Samatha stood still. "I won't bother anyone. I just want to sit and wait here." Victor tightened his grip on the empty water bottle on the counter. Then, without warning or hesitation, he snapped open the bottle's cap and poured water, straight onto her head. The soft sound of water breaking on fabric. Her blouse was soaked through. Cold drops ran down her forehead, touched the corner of her eyes, down her chin, and dripped onto the white stone floor. Her hair fell loose, tangled, and wet. Not a sound escaped Samantha's lips. Only her eyes, wide open, shocked, and hurt. Everyone in the hall seemed to hold their breath. The sound of water hitting the floor was as clear as a dropped needle. A young officer nearby lowered his head, unwilling to look. The woman at the desk quietly withdrew her hands from the keyboard. Victor breathed heavily, still holding the empty bottle. Before he could speak, Samantha stepped back slightly. Her small shoulders shook, not from cold, but from humiliation. She stood there, drenched, alone, and completely unprotected. "Who do you think you are to come in here claiming to be the sheriff's mother?" Victor growled. He tried to draw attention, but all he received was eerie silence. No one spoke, no one stepped forward. In everyone's mind, a question slowly emerged. What if she really was Brian Carter's mother? And if not, was it right to treat her like a rag in a place that should represent justice? Samantha said nothing. She turned away, not from shame, but because she knew tears would fall if she stayed another minute. But before she could leave, a voice rang out from the end of the corridor. Decisive, cold. "Cargill, stop." The glass doors at the front lobby swung open. The heavy clack of black shoes echoed firmly on the stone floor, steady but unhurried. Sheriff Brian Carter entered, his face calm as usual, familiar eyes sweeping quickly across the space. He did not expect to witness what lay ahead on a morning that seemed ordinary. Mrs. Samantha stood with her back to him, her light purple blouse soaked and clinging to her thin frame, her gray hair tangled, dripping droplets onto her shoulder. She did not walk fast or hurry, but was clearly leaving this place, quietly, alone, and heavy-hearted. Nothing like the strong mother he once knew, not at all. The entire lobby seemed to freeze as Brian stopped midway down the hallway. His eyes, usually steady and gentle, now sharp as knives. Everyone around seemed swept by his gaze. No one dared move. Then his gaze stopped. Victor Cargill still stood behind the counter, holding an empty water bottle. His face was pale, eyes wavering. Brian said nothing. He slowly approached his mother, gently removed his outer coat and draped it over her shoulders. That gesture needed no explanation. Samantha lifted her head, eyes no longer wet, but filled with unspeakable pain. They exchanged no words, yet everyone present clearly saw. Between them was a bond deeper than blood, a respect, trust, and shared pain just awakened. Turning to Victor, Brian spoke. His voice was not loud, but each word hit like a hammer against the wall, echoing clearly. "Deputy Victor Cargill, you are suspended immediately." No one breathed hard. That statement was a cold sentence. Victor stammered, trying to say something. "Sheriff, I don't know. I thought she was just... But Brian did not let him finish. He raised his hand, signaling silence, his gaze unwavering. "From my mother's case, I will deal with every corrupt part of this system, every rotten mindset like this." A young officer nearby hesitated briefly, then stepped forward with a colleague. They approached Victor, demanding his badge and weapon. Without resistance, Victor handed them over, utterly humiliated. His previous aggression vanished, leaving only a broken man dragged away from the desk. Brian glanced at a female staff member nearby. "Take my mother to the back break room. Lock the door. No one is allowed in." The woman nodded, gently supporting Samantha. Brian stood still, watching his mother leave the lobby, only turning away once the door closed completely. He needed no explanation, no immediate report. The truth was proven in that moment. The truth of how a person is treated without a title, without a uniform, and without anyone standing beside them. She was his mother, but even if she weren't, such an act was unforgivable. The headquarters lobby remained silent, but silence was no longer indifference. It was the choking breath caught in the throats of those witnessing honor soiled and then reclaimed, not by power, but by dignity and decisiveness. Brian entered the meeting room with heavy, determined steps, no prior notice, no official summons. Yet when he appeared, everyone was present. Mid-level officers sat upright around the long table, Some held half-finished notebooks, others folded hands on laps, eyes lowered to the floor. Brian did not sit. He stood in the center, with no need to pound the table or raise his voice. His gaze alone silenced the meeting. "I don't care who she is," he began, voice low and clear. "If she weren't my mother, so what? This morning's actions were wrong, unacceptable." The room thickened. Some bowed heads, others avoided his eyes. A throat cleared. Brian said little. He looked at each person, pausing on faces he once trusted, not to seek opponents, but to remind them this is not personal, this is a survival principle for the entire force they represent. "We are not allowed to wear this uniform and think we stand above justice," he continued. "No one has the right to use power to humiliate others, especially the vulnerable. This uniform does not exempt anyone from moral responsibility." Someone shifted quietly in the corner, seeming to protest, but fell silent. An older officer furrowed his brow but remained mute. Brian stared toward that corner. "I hear some think I'm overreacting, but I'm clear. Nothing is excessive when a person's dignity is torn apart, right where it should be protected." The room fell utterly silent. No one spoke up or agreed aloud. Brian paused for a moment, then declared, "Starting today, an independent internal investigation team will be established, with access to any area, any records, without prior notice. Weekly inspections will occur. Any acts of insult, threat, discrimination, or abuse of power, if discovered, will lead to immediate suspension without hearing. I'm not looking for someone to blame, but I will not allow anyone to stand outside the law while wearing this uniform." As he left the room, still no one spoke. Only a few eyes followed, flickers of fear, confusion, and some discontent. But he did not turn back. He had no time for those feelings now. Back in his office, Brian closed the door, did not turn on the light. He sat down, leaned back, and looked at the ceiling. In the darkness, he felt his shoulders bore the weight of a mountain. He was not angry because his mother was insulted. That anger faded the moment he saw the system's silence. He was angry knowing this was not the first time, and surely not the last if he did nothing. His hand rested on the desk where hundreds of case files he had handled once lay. But this time, what he had to deal with was not in any file. It lurked in hallways, in eyes, in habits, in silence. And to uproot it, he would have to dig deeper, deeper than any case before. The internal investigation was launched immediately after Brian's statement. The inspection team consisted of 3 outsiders, granted almost unlimited access to records, work schedules, and even internal cameras. No one was exempt. No one was informed before being called in for interviews. They appeared quietly, moving through the corridors like silent shadows of the truth. At first, the atmosphere in the headquarters was merely cautious, but after 2 days, it turned into a heavy fog of suspicion that clung to every glance. Brian still showed up on time, spoke in a calm voice, and tried to keep everything normal, but he realized earlier than anyone else. Those who once saw him as a guide no longer looked him in the eyes. Short conversations in the break room disappeared. Casual remarks were replaced by silence. Some swapped shifts to avoid contact. Others made excuses to skip small team meetings. In the room once filled with voices, there was now only the creaking of swivel chairs and the weary scratching of pens on paper. Rumors spread like wildfire. One afternoon, as Brian passed by the break room, he overheard a fragmented sentence. "He's turning his mother's water incident into an excuse to purge the force as he wishes." No one knew he was there. He did not speak. He just kept walking, slowing his pace by a beat. He was not angry, only tired, because he understood. Justice, when it touches the dark habits of routine, always meets resistance. The investigation team continued its work. They did not publicize conclusions. They did not declare who was right or wrong, but that only made people more anxious. Some officers began refusing to answer follow-up questions during interviews, even though they had the right to remain silent. Some removed their personal files from public computers for fear of surveillance. Others changed their computer passwords. For the 3rd time that week, the mild climax came on Thursday afternoon. Doyle, a young officer personally promoted by Brian, was called into Lieutenant Keller's private office. The meeting lasted no more than 10 minutes, but when Doyle emerged, his face was pale. He said nothing to anyone and quietly returned to his desk. That evening, he submitted a request to withdraw from the investigation response team. When Brian met him in the hallway, only a look was exchanged. No greeting, no explanation, but Doyle's eyes told Brian enough. He was being pushed between two currents, loyalty and the fear of being labeled. The next morning, during the usual briefing, Brian read the weekly report as usual, but he clearly saw that everyone in the room seemed to be listening to something other than his voice, a heartbeat, a soft knocking, a thick suspicion that needed no name. Brian did not blame them. He knew too well this system was used to living in a safe zone, where everything was handled internally and no one was truly exposed to the light. That was the day he fully understood. What he was facing was not just wrongdoing, but a silence nurtured from within. At first, it was vague whispers in the elevator. Someone thinks they're a saint. To clean up, you have to know if you're clean first. No one mentioned Brian's name, but the tone, the glances, and the deliberately left pauses after each remark made everyone understand. Suspicion was no longer hidden. It had become a clear crack, creeping into every corner of the corridors. Brian heard it all. He did not react, nor did he correct it. The whispers behind his back shared a common trait, loud enough to hurt but not strong enough to confront directly. Some senior officers began showing more obvious attitudes. They gave all sorts of reasons to avoid contact with the investigation team, complained about increased workload, complicated procedures, then sighed, "We're here to protect the community, not answer questions like criminals." A command meeting was held over the weekend. The atmosphere was completely different from before, cold and defensive. A lieutenant proposed, "We should reconsider the investigation team's authority. This level of intrusion dilutes the morale of the force." Some nodded. Another added, "I think we're losing focus on the main mission." Brian listened. When everyone stopped, he spoke slowly. "Morale isn't lost because of the investigation. It's because there is something to hide." The room fell silent. This time, no one nodded. Among the group, Captain Rebecca Shaw, his right hand for more than 6 years, sat quietly without speaking. Usually she was the first to speak. Today she only lightly flipped a page in her notebook, eyes lingering on points that did not really need reading. Brian noticed the change, and he knew a bigger fracture was silently forming. 3 days later, an anonymous email appeared on the internal system. No sender name, but the subject was clear: "When justice is manipulated by personal grudges." The content accused Brian of exploiting his mother's incident to carry out a deliberate purge campaign. The email listed a series of dismissals, unusual inspections, and suspicions of bias by the investigation team. No one confirmed reading that email, but within one afternoon the entire administrative area was whispering about it. Some quietly changed their personal email passwords. A few removed Brian's picture from their desktop backgrounds. No one called him sheriff outside working hours anymore. Although no one dared say it to his face, Brian understood clearly. He had officially crossed the line from a respected leader to a symbol of division. That afternoon, when entering the command room, Brian looked around and saw the familiar chairs, but the nods of recognition he used to receive were gone. Only evasive or cold eyes remained. A young officer passed by him, polite but completely avoiding eye contact. Brian was neither sad nor disappointed. He just felt empty, as if what he had fought to preserve, trust, transparency, respect, was being drained little by little, not by enemies, but by those who once stood beside him. "My voice now only echoes inside my own head," he thought. The words went unspoken, but resonated forever in the room, where he was now alone, and the thick silence spread like an invisible dust, covering all truths. Victor Cargill sat in the old pickup truck, the engine running but the air conditioning off. The air inside was stifling. Outside, Heavy rain lashed the windshield as if the world itself were running a fever. He pulled his phone from his shirt pocket, hesitation flickering across his fingers before he dialed a familiar number. No name saved, just the last 4 digits, 3907. His brother. "What's up, calling at this hour?" Jason's voice came through, low and curt. "They're letting us go. No pay, no protection, all because of that old bitch." Victor ground out the words, each one a measured release of his fury. He recounted everything, from being humiliated in front of the whole precinct to Brian Carter's cold stare, and how the internal affairs team had started tearing through every drawer and file as if everyone were guilty. Jason was silent for the first few minutes. Victor could hear fingertips tapping on a wooden desk, proof that his brother's mind was elsewhere. Finally, Jason asked, "You want to teach her a lesson? Or you want her gone?" Victor stayed quiet. A long pause, then he exhaled, slow and steady, as if swallowing something unspeakable. Jason understood. He didn't need further instructions. "I've got this," he replied shortly, then hung up. Less than 2 hours later, in an old garage behind Auburn's auto shop, Jason met with 3 familiar faces: Snake, Rollo, and Benny, men who'd managed to wriggle free of the law despite assault and protection rackets thanks to insufficient evidence and recanting witnesses. Jason pushed open the heavy metal door, armed only with a paper bag stuffed with cash. "I need you to do a small favor," he said, seating himself. "No blood, no vandalism, just remind an old lady she's being watched." Snake sneered, glancing at his companions. "You hiring hitmen or just making threats?" Jason didn't smile. He slid the bag of money forward. "Just stake out, send a few signals. If I wanted mayhem, I wouldn't need the 3 of you." The deal was struck quickly. They took the cash, the photo of Mrs. Samata, the layout of her house, her morning walking route, and a list of her usual stops: the pharmacy, the grocery store, the laundromat. They left before the rain let up, like shadows seeping off the town's safety map. That night, around 3 a.m., a black sedan with no plates crept down the street where Mrs. Samatha lived. Its headlights were off. A security camera at house number 43 recorded a blurry image of the strange vehicle. No crime was committed, no noise made, but by morning, Mrs. Samatha found her gate ajar, despite remembering locking it tight the night before. She told Brian nothing, she simply locked it more carefully that evening. Little did she know, this was only the beginning, and some threats, though unseen, speak loudest in the dark. The old garage at Ridgepoint's south end bore no sign but just a low-roofed metal shed hidden behind a junkyard. Jason Cargill stood on the oil-stained concrete floor, facing the 3 men he'd entrusted with dirty work, while keeping his hands clean: Snake, Rollo, and Benny. No jokes this time, no warnings needed. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Plan's simple," Jason said, placing his hand on a map of Mrs. Samatha's neighborhood. "We don't touch her, we don't break anything. Just make her feel unsafe." Benny chuckled hollowly. "You playing ghost?" Jason remained stone-faced. "I want her to be sleepless. I want her to look over her shoulder every time she steps outside. No traces. If any of you screw up, I won't bail you out." Over the next 3 days, Ridgepoint appeared calm on the surface, but beneath that mask, shadows began to infiltrate Mrs. Samatha's daily routine. Early mornings, when she walked to the grocery store, a gray car would sit motionless at the end of the street, same spot, 3 mornings in a row. The man inside never stepped out or rolled down his window, but she felt his gaze through the tinted glass. The next afternoon, the landline rang. She picked up. Silence on the other end, just steady breathing. Calling back, got no answer. She mentioned it to Brian when he stopped by. He placed a hand on her shoulder and advised, "Maybe you're just stressed. I'll check the neighborhood cameras, don't worry." But she wasn't reassured. On the 3rd night, while choosing fruit at the night market, she sensed someone closing in behind her. Turning, she saw a tall man with a thick beard and a black jacket staring at her. No blink, No words. When she stepped back, he didn't advance. He just stood there long enough to fray every nerve in her body. The vendor beside her, a woman who'd lived in Ridgepoint for over 20 years, quietly approached after the man left. "I've seen him before," she whispered. "Suspect in 2 assaults last year. No one had enough proof to hold him." Mrs. Samuth gripped her basket handle so hard that a piece of fruit fell and rolled away, but she didn't bend to pick it up. That evening, Brian returned to the precinct, but detoured to the security office instead of heading straight to his office. He reviewed over 8 hours of footage from around Mrs. Sametha's block, and froze at one detail. The black sedan without plates that had appeared days before had also been spotted near a similar stalking incident 8 blocks away exactly 1 week earlier. No doubt remained. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a calculated, coordinated campaign targeting his greatest vulnerability, his mother. Without hesitation, Brian grabbed his phone and dialed the one person he still trusted, Maria Jennings, the independent investigator who'd helped him crack a major protection racket case last year. It rang 3 times before she answered. "Maria, I need you here now. Someone's playing a dangerous game. And this time, they've set their sights on someone who can't defend herself." Despite recent unsettling events, Mrs. Samantha Carter still kept her habit of walking each morning. It was how she kept her breathing steady and stayed alert in an increasingly warped world. That evening, she left home as usual, slipping on a light coat and taking her phone. The sky over Ridgepoint was bleak, dew clinging to the pavement, and she sensed something was off. A strange silence draped over a neighborhood normally filled with children's laughter and barking dogs. Turning into the short alley leading to the small market, she halted. From a hidden corner by the brick wall, 3 men stepped out at once. They said nothing. Behind black masks, their eyes were cold and fierce. No weapons, no shouting, yet they stood less than 3 meters away, far too close for her to pivot and retreat. The man in the middle, tall and broad, rasped, "You walk this route every morning, don't you, Mrs. Carter? You ought to be more careful." The second man chuckled softly, his tone even and slow. "Some things are best left in the past. Touch them, and you risk danger." The third said nothing but took a half step forward, enough for her to know she was being cornered on purpose. Her hand clenched the phone in her pocket. The screen was on. 2 taps and she could call for help, but her fingers trembled. She wasn't sure she could be fast enough. A side gate creaked open. From behind the bars, an elderly man peeked out, phone in hand. It was Frank Halderman, a retired officer who'd lived here for nearly 18 years. Sensing trouble, he quietly began recording from a distance, then dialed the rapid response line. Back at headquarters, Brian was in an internal meeting with the surveillance tech team when his phone buzzed. The screen flashed red, "Threat near residence." He read the brief alert. An elderly woman surrounded by 3 suspects. Location matches Samantha Carter. He rose immediately, cutting off the meeting to issue orders. Lock down District 7. No live fire. Block all exits. Protect her at all costs. The rapid response team arrived swiftly. Sirens shattered the neighborhood's calm as red lights swept across the brick wall where the assailants still stood. 2 fled in opposite directions. The first man hesitated only a moment before officers subdued him with a clean arm lock, no injuries. Mrs. Carter said nothing as they escorted her into the patrol car. Her face was ashen, her knuckles had turned white from clutching her bag's strap. She didn't collapse or cry out, but the composure she always wore was gone. Gazing through the window as they drove back, she seemed less interested in the streets than in reclaiming the sense of safety she'd believed unshakable. News spread faster than Brian could manage. Before long, Frank's video of Mrs. Carter, trapped in that silent circle, flooded every social platform. An elderly woman, standing alone with trembling eyes, amid silent attackers, was enough to spark public outrage. Many posts carried the tagline #CongleChoback Carter, with messages like, If the sheriff's own mother can be threatened like this, how can ordinary people ever feel safe? Local TV ran non-stop coverage, and comments split sharply. Some decried it as proof of deep rot in the security system. Even the sheriff's family lacked protection. Others suspected a stage ploy for Brian to boost his standing amid unpopular internal audits. Anonymous accounts sneered. She wasn't hurt at all. Who hasn't had phone jitters and failed to call? What troubled Brian most was an internal revelation. A District 7 supervisor quietly admitted the alley cameras were deactivated shortly before the incident. Not a technical glitch, but a deliberate command from someone with high-level access. No one but the direct supervisor could have done that. He immediately convened an emergency city council meeting. The chamber was packed. The press was barred, though recordings leaked afterward. One council member challenged him. "You can't even secure your own mother. How will you protect 18,000 residents?" No one spoke up for him. Rebecca Shaw sat silent, eyes fixed on the tabletop. Before tensions eased, a new finding surfaced. Dash cam footage from a patrol car showed an officer driving past the alley shortly before the attackers appeared. He didn't stop or report anything. He'd long opposed system reforms and claimed he saw nothing unusual. Yet the clip clearly shows him glancing toward where Mrs. Carter stood and doing nothing. Brian said nothing more. He excused himself from the meeting, returned to his office, and instructed his secretary to print the access logs for the surveillance system over the past week. Alone, he crossed out familiar names and faces, those who had nodded along with him in strategy sessions. He felt no anger, no confusion, only the inescapable truth. The system didn't collapse from outside. It was rotting from within, through silent assent, willful ignorance, and those choosing rank over integrity. Rain began to fall outside. Brian stared through the window, list in hand, open to the second page. For the first time, he thought to call Maria Jennings, not for help, but to launch a real investigation. After the intense hearing and the cold stares from his own team, Brian Carter knew his time on his side was running out. He could no longer rely on a system already rotten at its core. Vague reactions and evasive answers in meetings only confirmed what he had long suspected. The truth was being concealed by powerful, unseen hands. With no other choice, Brian decided to take a further step. He contacted an independent auditing unit known for intervening in police departments suspected of corruption or ethical violations and previously collaborating with the Department of Justice. After just 2 calls and a secret meeting, a plan was set. A comprehensive audit of all internal operations over the past 5 years, covering finances, disciplinary records, and citizen complaints. No announcements, no press conferences, no circulated documents. The audit team entered Ridgepoint like ordinary technicians, equipped with the deepest system access and a checklist of over 300 inspection items. Within less than a week, the numbers began to speak. More than 40 internal complaints, mostly related to abusive behavior, racial discrimination, or abuse of power, were stamped resolved, but lacked any accompanying processing records. Many had internal notes stating, "Do not escalate to inspector, handle internally." A budget report revealed significant irregularities. Expenses for maintenance of surveillance equipment had doubled in the last 2 years but lacked original invoices. Deeper tracing showed many payment vouchers signed by retired supervisors, no longer available for questioning. The climax came on Friday evening. Maria Jennings received an anonymous email with an attached file. Inside were blurry scans with smudged ink, but clearly internal memos that once existed. Under each memo were signatures of administrative staff and a handwritten red ink order. Destroy per verbal instruction was RR. The sender was Gwen Morales, a former secretary who left the department last year for personal reasons. In a brief message, she wrote, "I kept these records. I almost destroyed them completely once, but my conscience wouldn't allow it. If you are looking for answers, start here." In at least 3 memos, the name Rebecca Shaw appeared as the person who did not approve forwarding the records to the inspector for lack of sufficient grounds. Yet when cross-checked with procedures, Maria found Rebecca had signed off the original case reports herself, meaning she both received and blocked them, a concealed act between authority and manipulation. That evening, Brian sat alone in his office facing a preliminary report sent by the audit team leader. The 47-page document detailed every financial line, system review charts, and management blind spots. But he stopped at the last page, where a line was underlined in red pen. The system isn't malfunctioning, it's being steered from within. He put the document down, leaned back in his chair. Something was no longer any doubt, and to shine light on the darkest corners, he would have to prepare for what few inside this system dared face, the truth. The basement of the Ridgepoint Police Department had no cameras, no air conditioning, and was never mentioned in the new staff manuals. Old wooden shelves covered in thick dust were stacked like a forgotten wall of time. Maria Jennings, holding a flashlight, flipping through minutes, returned to the place that once gave her chills every time she passed by, now the starting point for a chain of discoveries that could change everything. With a small audit team, they divided rows of file boxes labeled by year and area code. Each box contained hundreds of paper files, most never digitized, due to low priority or not currently relevant. But in those yellowed papers, every handwritten line and crossed-out word carried more weight than any automated report. On the very first morning, Maria found a blurred testimony, dated September 2019. The charge was assault causing injury while on duty, the victim an unnamed black youth without address or signed confirmation. The handling officer noted only internal resolution, no further investigation, no file code, no duty officer's name, no crime scene photo. Maria cross-checked the personnel records for that shift. Both Victor Cargill and Jason Cargill were present. More suspiciously, both left the scene just an hour after the incident, with no report filed. Was it a clerical error or a deliberate erasure of traces? As the audit team dug deeper, a financial document hidden among technical records caught attention. A camera system maintenance contract signed with Lincoln Technologies, a company based in the neighboring city. The contract bore Rebecca Shaw's signature, then responsible for logistics supervision. More notably, the company was run by her brother-in-law. Lincoln Technologies currently operates the neighborhood camera system, where Mrs. Samata had been surveilled, and coincidentally, that area lost signal exactly 15 minutes before the incident. The atmosphere in the file room thickened. Before any concrete action, a team member, Kevin, received an anonymous text. "Stop or your son will be suspended." The message came from an unknown number, and shortly after, Kevin's work email was hacked, forcing the group to disconnect from the network. Brian was stunned for a few seconds upon hearing the news. He began to understand this was beyond an internal investigation. It was an organized protection racket, infiltrating from command levels to external civilian relations. He could no longer allow audit reports to be sent through normal administrative channels. Every transmitted data would be monitored or erased. That very evening, Brian and Maria held a secret meeting with the audit leader, in a room with only 3 people, no recording devices, no network. On the table lay the collected files and a list of directly involved persons. "We will send everything to the federal prosecutor's office," Brian said. "Even if the evidence is not yet official?" the auditor asked. Maria nodded firmly. "If we wait for due process, all evidence will be burned before dawn." No one objected. They knew this game had no rules left, and every second of hesitation invited hidden forces to act first. A silent but heavy wave began to infiltrate the Ridgepoint County Police Department. Familiar faces, those who had stood alongside Brian Carter on many fronts, now started to show doubt, even opposition to the reforms he initiated. They did not voice loud objections or make overt acts of defiance. But every glance, every whispered conversation in corners was enough for Brian to feel an invisible pressure tightening around him. Exchanges took place in break rooms, hallways, and closed-door meetings. "Brian is overdoing it," one officer whispered to a colleague nearby. "He forgets who he is and how we built this police department." Another nodded, eyes filled with discontent. "At this rate, we'll lose everything. Not just power, but also unity." Those words were like small knives tearing the veil of trust that once surrounded Brian. Captain Rebecca Shaw felt this shift most keenly. Once a loyal ally, a trusted friend, and an indispensable partner to Brian, she now stood at a fragile boundary between loyalty and pressure from teammates and superiors. Rebecca noticed one's friendly looks fading, secret calls and meetings held without Brian but discussing him with suspicion. Rumors about Brian being too rigid and inflexible began to spread. In a tense internal meeting, Rebecca tried to act as a bridge, offering gentle and cautious advice. "We need to view these changes objectively," she said calmly but clearly. "Brian doesn't want to destroy the past, but to build a better future for the department and the community." The response was doubtful looks, slight headshakes, and vague, unclear answers. Pressure from outside, combined with internal divisio, and made Rebecca feel isolated in the organization she had devoted her career to. Every time she saw Brian, she wanted to express support, but could not hide her worries about the future and her own safety. Small conflicts grew bigger, leading Rebecca to question her loyalty and choices. In subsequent meetings, tension escalated. Rebecca was drawn into heated debates between conservatives and reformers. She understood that without careful handling, this polarization could cost the department the unity necessary to face external challenges. But how to remain loyal to Brian while ensuring harmony within the team was a difficult question she had yet to answer. As days passed, signs of betrayal became clearer. Trusted colleagues who once stood with Brian now avoided him. Sidelined talk turned into deeper schemes. Rebecca realized she was no longer neutral, but caught in a spiraling division. She knew every upcoming decision would affect not only her career, but also herself and those she valued. Betrayal within the ranks was not only a personal challenge for Brian, but a painful lesson on the value of trust and loyalty. In those lonely moments, Rebecca stood at a crossroads, forced to choose a path that would decide her future and that of the Ridgepoint Police Department. Pressure from outside and covert opinions inside the department weighed heavily on Rebecca Shaw. She was no longer simply Brian Carter's loyal ally, but drawn into a vortex of tough decisions and survival choices. Career, reputation, and loyalty, all pieces that clashed within her mind at that moment. Secret discussions emerged where Rebecca was pulled into private meetings with Brian's opponents. Not just gentle warnings, but tempting promises or vague threats behind closed doors. It was said that in the world of power, choices are not always right or wrong, but survival or failure. Each time faced with these offers, Rebecca's emotions twisted and wavered. She knew well what Brian had done, his efforts for the department and the community. Her loyalty and respect for that leader still burned brightly, yet responsibility to herself and her career pulled her the other way, a force that, if not aligned with, could cost her everything. More than once, Rebecca met Brian privately, hoping to maintain their bond and seek understanding. Those conversations, though gentle, carried an unspoken tension. Brian understood her burdens. He did not blame, but tried to inspire strength and perseverance. "I need you by my side, Rebecca. Not for me, but for what is right," he said, eyes deep as if seeing into her soul. However, tensions escalated as pressure from superiors and opposition increased relentlessly. She stood between two forces, unable to resolve alone. Secret meetings, exchanged messages, and probing looks made her feel trapped in an invisible cage, unable to escape. Finally, In a surprising turn, Rebecca decided to comply with her superiors and agreed to testify against Brian in the upcoming hearing. This decision shocked not only Brian but also shook the entire department. It was a powerful blow to the trust and loyalty everyone had built. In Rebecca's heart, this was not simple betrayal, but the complexity of a forced choice between duty, self-preservation, and harsh realities. She understood that this decision would bring serious consequences for all parties. Brian, herself, and the system they struggled to reform. Rebecca knew that from now on, her path would be difficult, but she also realized that sometimes growth does not come from easy choices, but from moments when one must face oneself and the greatest challenges. Perhaps now the whole world wanted to bring Brian down, and she could only share part of that burden with him. Brian began to notice clear signs of covert surveillance and control within the police department. Every small action of his was recorded and reported to the opposing faction. Phone calls were suddenly interrupted, messages went unanswered, and many colleagues avoided or acted awkwardly when dealing with him directly. The workspace, once a place where he felt safe, became suffocating and tense, like an invisible network tightening around him. The presence of dissenters was no longer subtle. A group of influential white officers in the department started openly criticizing Brian. They claimed the changes and reforms he proposed were disrupting normal operations, causing internal fractures and loss of unity. The criticism grew harsher, from closed-door meetings to whispered talks in corridors, creating a clear atmosphere of confusion and division. Over time, the criticisms escalated beyond words into smear campaigns aimed at undermining Brian's reputation. Baseless rumors accusing him of abusing power, inefficiency, and even unfounded corruption charges spread widely. The clear goal was to dismantle Brian's image and standing among colleagues and the community. The tension in the police department became visibly intense. Meetings Brian attended were often isolating. He was not allowed to open discussion, and his opinions were ignored or strongly opposed. His authority was limited, and important decisions were delayed or influenced by opposing factions. Even loyal staff faced pressure, enduring contempt, warnings, and psychological tactics from other colleagues. Brian could not deny the overwhelming loneliness in his soul. The mounting pressure, from colleagues' suspicion to covert betrayals, created a harsh psychological challenge. However, he did not let these hardships break his spirit. Brian sought to maintain inner balance and strengthen his mental resilience to remain steadfast on his chosen path. Each passing day he learned to face suspicious glances and rumors while focusing on reform and rebuilding trust. Brian understood this was the toughest phase, but also a necessary step to create real change in the Ridgepoint Police Department. With perseverance and relentless determination, Brian gradually overcame isolation and pressure to move forward. He knew only strength and steadfastness could help him maintain leadership while continuing to fight for justice and transparency within the organization. His mind constantly reminded him of why he became a police officer: to protect people, bring justice, and build a safe community environment. Despite isolation and suspicion, he never abandoned that mission. Brian understood that, in this battle, steadfastness and courage would be the key to success. He leveraged external relationships, from social organizations, media, to community leaders, to exert pressure and seek support. Brian knew the fight was not only inside the police department, but also in society, where the community's voice could help push back old, conservative forces. Step by step, he regained some trust from officers and staff while rebuilding a more united work environment. The pressure remained, but Brian knew how to transform difficulty into motivation to keep advancing. Despite hardships and challenges, he maintained faith in change, believing justice and truth would ultimately be honored and protected. Brian was determined to become the standard-bearer, leading Ridgepoint Police firmly on the path of fairness and transparency. The smear campaign started among the white officers in the department who disagreed with Brian Carter's style and reform determination. They avoided direct confrontation, choosing instead to use rumors to weaken his credibility. Malicious rumors, fabricated and spread through departments, infiltrated small office conversations, corridors, and even cafes near headquarters. Some said Brian was inefficient. Others accused him of using personal power to purge factions. Heavier rumors labeled him with words like corruption or abuse of authority. These rumors were spread not only internally, but also externally, through community groups and social networks, creating widespread anxiety. Things became increasingly uncontrollable. Brian's reputation was seriously affected. Even officers who once trusted and stood by him began to view him with suspicion. They became more cautious working with Brian, no longer sharing information openly as before. The division and mistrust spread, causing a noticeable decline in work efficiency and severely damaging team morale. Nevertheless, Brian did not let these rumors shake his determination. He focused entirely on his work, using real results to prove that change was necessary and correct. Brian began rebuilding relationships not only within the department but also outside with the community and legal organizations. The goal was to create broad support, reduce pressure and suspicion. Communication programs and meetings were held continuously to dispel misunderstandings. Brian chaired dialogue sessions, listened to opinions, and directly answered questions. These encounters not only helped restore trust, but also strengthened unity, helping everyone better understand the importance of reform. Despite facing isolation and heavy pressure, Brian never gave up on the goal of restoring trust and building a fair, clean police force. He recognized this as the greatest challenge of his career, possibly losing many allies and friends, but he was willing to accept those sacrifices. Persistence and determination became internal strength, helping Brian get through this difficult period. He understood that only by being strong and resilient himself could he revive a fractured system. Deep down, Brian knew dark days would pass, giving way to the light of justice and transparency. Maria Jennings was no longer an unfamiliar name in Ridgepoint. Previously, she had worked as an investigative reporter for a state newspaper, famous for a series of exposés on police misconduct. But after a string of threats, losing her job, and nearly being prosecuted for unauthorized access to classified documents, Maria vanished from the mainstream press. Now she operated quietly as an independent investigator. Samantha Carter and the pattern of signs pointing to a manipulative network within the Ridgepoint police system, Maria decided to make her return. She gave no warning, only left Brian a message. "I need to meet you as soon as possible." The meeting took place at a small cafe 3 blocks from downtown. Maria sat in a shadowed corner, wearing a coarse wool jacket and a hood that hid half her face. She outlined her proposal. She needed access to the internal surveillance system, bypassing official gateways. "If I'm right, every copy is being filtered, deleted, or altered before anyone sees the original." Brian was silent. He knew she spoke the truth. Finally, he agreed to grant temporary access via an old training server station no longer listed on the current network map. That very night, Maria began her work. She downloaded every log, recording data transfers, clock-ins, and document accesses. All showed signs of tampering. Blank lines inserted in logs, timestamps resynchronized, many folders appearing empty despite their file sizes. 3 days later, Maria's work email account began to show interference. Some messages were marked "read," though she hadn't opened them. Her calendar was altered, and a spoofed email in her name was sent to the audit team, refusing collaboration. Luckily, a recipient familiar with her style reported it. That wasn't all. Her laptop was breached one evening while she worked at a temporary office near the courthouse. IP analysis traced the intrusion to an internal address within the police department. When she called that number back, the line went dead the moment her voice was recognized. An old industry friend called her, "This time, they're not just scaring you, Maria. Someone doesn't want Ridgepoint to survive this wave. She closed her laptop, stared out the window at the flickering streetlights, but she did not leave. Under the guise of an audit collaborator, Maria began to compile evidence on 3 senior officers, each of whom had abstained in last year's internal transfer votes. Cross-referencing with recent data loss incidents, she found a peculiar pattern. The unsupervised zones matched exactly those overseen in rotation by these 3. The final record she reached, written by hand, bore a name long unmentioned: Jason Cargill. Maria sat beside a data engineer named Ellis in an unmarked third-floor room. Ellis had worked for a non-profit investigating cybercrime and was now an independent collaborator whom Maria trusted. Together, they reviewed the timeline map of the surveillance system, data that should have been continuously preserved but displayed inexplicable gaps, or key monitoring points around headquarters. Main garage, security office, administrative lobby, and basement corridor all reported errors within the same week. The system recorded emergency maintenance, yet no official orders or work tickets existed. Maria then checked the civil complaint schedule and discovered that after each maintenance, one complaint file was canceled, rejected, or rerouted without acknowledgement. The more she compared, the clearer the pattern became. Someone was systematically cleansing the system on a cycle visible only to those who knew where to look. Ellis frowned when he found a hidden file on the old backup server named Obsidian Loop, the Black Stone Loop. The data was encrypted, but Brian's temporary access sufficed to decrypt it. When Maria opened it, she fell silent for a long moment. Inside was a string of emails between 3 former Ridgepoint commanders and the third-party maintenance firm. One subject line read, "Confirm disabling of unauthorized communications." The final line in the email made them both hold their breath. "No personal handling required. Just eliminate the access channel." The entire content revealed that, rather than addressing complaints or taking corrective actions, the apparatus chose to erase transmission paths, tamper with cameras, and use maintenance as a means to silence the system. No individual was named directly, but the roundabout language and deeply technical jargon made clear this was no accident. It was a plan. Maria quickly backed up the file and sent an encrypted copy to the federal attorney who had assisted her in exposing misconduct in another state 3 years earlier. When Brian was informed, he simply said, "We're no longer in the investigation phase. We're sitting on a bomb." He knew that if they went public at the wrong moment, the system would retaliate and wipe out the remaining evidence. No one spoke further. In that sealed room, only the hum of the fan and the flicker of the backup complete icon broke the silence. Maria stared at the file icon on the screen, as if it were the first fracture in the thick glass, encasing the whole truth. Maria Jennings moved through the dimming late afternoon light with quiet, furtive steps, doing her best to avoid curious eyes. She knew the documents she carried could change everything, but they also painted a target on her back. The corrupt faction within the police department wasn't just trying to silence the truth. They had no qualms about using violence to protect their own interests. She paused in a shadowed alcove beside a narrow alley, pulled out her phone, and the USB drive containing evidence of criminal activity, fraud, and deep-rooted abuses of power. She sent an encrypted message to Brian Carter, giving her location and promising to meet him soon to hand over the files. A few minutes later, a sleek black car flashed through, its headlights flickering on, then off. Maria sensed an unwanted presence. She had no choice but to move quickly. No sooner had she left the alley than masked assailants sprang from the darkness. They advanced in perfect sync, closing the distance before she could react. The attack was over in seconds. Fists and boots rained down, and she fell to the pavement. The sounds of impact, ragged breathing, and threats echoed in the empty street. Maria tried to fight back, but she was outnumbered and lost consciousness where she fell. When the attackers fled, she lay sprawled and battered, unconscious, her phone powered off, her remaining documents scattered nearby. Though clues to the assault were present, they had been expertly concealed. complicating any investigation. Brian received the alert while preparing for a critical meeting. The alarm blared in his ear and his mind spun. He dropped everything and raced to the scene, his team's worried faces lending gravity to the moment. He found Maria unconscious on the ground and felt his heart wrench at the danger she'd faced. He understood this was no random mugging, but a grave warning from those desperate to hide the truth. Without hesitation, he ordered an immediate search. Teams were deployed at once, multiple units combing every corner, every street, every potential hideout. Investigators analyzed the scant evidence left at the scene, while Brian personally directed operations, inspiring his team and driving them forward. Brian's anguish mingled with fury, but he refused to falter. He was determined to secure justice for Maria and ensure her attackers faced the law. This battle was harder than any before, yet he knew it marked only the beginning of a daunting journey. Maria Jennings' disappearance shocked the investigative squad and sent waves of fear through Ridge Point. Rumors spread like wildfire. The woman who had exposed the department's darkest corners was now missing. Many believed the police leadership had resorted to sinister tactics to protect itself. Under mounting pressure, Brian knew rescuing Maria was not just a personal mission, but the institution's responsibility to safeguard transparency and justice. He teamed up with his elite investigative unit, extending collaboration to federal agencies, rapid response teams, and local volunteers. Still, the probe met unprecedented obstacles. Every trace of Maria's cell signals, security cameras at her known haunts, had been disabled at critical moments. Some witnesses were threatened or disappeared after offering information. The media slammed Brian with sensational headlines, questioning whether the force had ignored this grave incident. Speculation about insider involvement in Maria's abduction only intensified tensions. Brian became the focal point of both criticism and hope. Inside, he wrestled with desperation and determination. Small leads offered hope, yet no clear sign of Maria's whereabouts emerged. As a leader, he knew his collapse would spell defeat for the entire team. So he steeled himself and his staff. He was not alone. Loyal colleagues like Captain Marcus Hill and Detective Lana Ramirez stood by him, pulling in unorthodox favors, questioning anyone who knew Maria, and scrutinizing suspect locations. Regular closed-door briefings tracked each development in the search. Protected witness testimonies finally yielded fresh leads: a suspicious vehicle seen near Maria's last known spot, an anonymous call on the day she vanished, and newly hired officers at the precinct with murky pasts. These threads wove into a complex web, forcing Brian's team to adapt continuously. Unresolved mysteries deepened the suspense and opened multiple paths for the next phase of their investigation. Brian realized that finding Maria Jennings was not only a rescue mission, but a fight to uphold faith in justice within a system teetering on the brink. Starting from the expansion of the internal investigation with the involvement of external agencies, long-hidden secrets gradually surfaced piece by piece, like a complex puzzle revealing itself in the light. Clues about the illegal activities of Jason Cargill and his associates were no longer vague rumors, but became so clear they could not be denied. Jason, Victor Cargill's younger brother, had long been an underground power figure within the police department and was now under legal scrutiny. From manipulating internal records to falsifying investigation reports, Jason and his close allies used every trick to protect personal interests and conceal misconduct. Confidential documents, seized from computer searches, phones, and email accounts, exposed numerous secret calls, anonymous messages, and suspicious money transfers, all indicating a sophisticated network manipulating power within the department. Many former colleagues of Jason began to reveal the truth despite facing threats and warnings. Some chose silence out of fear, but others decided to stand up and speak out about what they had witnessed firsthand. Their testimonies not only strengthened the evidence, but also exposed a long-running plan to hide the truth. Beyond ordinary abuses of power, Jason was also accused of witness intimidation, bribery, and interfering in investigations to distort outcomes. He exploited close relationships with senior leaders to maintain power, using that network to silence dissenting voices and shield himself with an impenetrable facade. However, all these efforts seemed futile, as external investigative agencies with broader authority and resources stepped in. They coordinated closely with Sheriff Brian Carter and his team to trace every clue and piece of evidence, no matter how small. Secret investigations were conducted, with records, bank data, and transactions thoroughly reviewed, gradually uncovering the full truth. Closed meetings and interrogations were held continuously. Jason faced sharp questions and mounting evidence. Despite attempts to evade and deny, every small detail further entangled him. Investigators' reports painted a clear picture of systematic abuse of power and corruption. Step by step, Jason Cargill's public and official image shifted from a powerful influencer to a symbol of collapse and failure. Those who once admired or feared him began to turn their backs, while those previously silenced by fear now spoke out boldly. The atmosphere in the police department also changed accordingly. Whispers, suspicious glances, and covert fears filled the place. Crowds outside the police station grew interested, the media paid attention, and the community raised questions about the future of the security system here. This was a turning point when a new era began to open and corrupt figures like Jason could no longer hold onto their thrones. The truth was finally exposed, and justice was closer than ever. As evidence became overwhelming and undeniable, pressure on Jason Cargill and his allies intensified. They realized everything was collapsing before their eyes, leaving them no choice but to use all means to protect their power and reputation. From secret meetings to hurried gatherings in the shadows, they sought to connect external powerful relationships to buy time, delay investigations, and cool the rising tide of public outrage. Not only relying on bribery, Jason and his group also pressured witnesses. Those who dared to accuse them or hold sensitive information were subtly threatened, from quiet warnings to harsher action, aimed at shaking their resolve or forcing silence. In many cases, witnesses were stripped of rights, transferred, or faced unexpected incidents preventing them from continuing their involvement in the investigation. However, all opposition efforts could not stop the close coordination between Sheriff Brian Carter, Maria Jennings, and independent external auditing agencies. They utilized all resources, from legal experts to experienced investigators, to review evidence, filter information, and solidify accusations as firmly as possible. Continuous secret meetings were held, frequent internal hearings took place, and updated reports were sent regularly, creating relentless pressure on Jason's faction. The atmosphere inside the police department noticeably changed, previously marked by silent endurance, caution, and fear when mentioning Jason. Now people whispered openly. Stories and rumors about Jason and his associates' peril spread widely. Respect and fear were gradually replaced by suspicion and caution. Within offices, police groups no longer silently endured but began to voice support for change. Some who remained silent, fearing job loss, now courageously provided additional information to investigations. They saw in Brian a steadfast leader, a symbol of justice and real change. Jason Cargill, once an emblem of untouchable power, now faced isolation and judgment not only from the law but also from colleagues and the community. Unanswered calls, closed doors, and cold looks replaced former respect, making him keenly feel his downfall. At this time, the opposition's most sophisticated plans and conspiracies began to be exposed, leaving them no place to hide. They understood they had no choice but to face the truth and be accountable for their wrongdoings. From the silent walls, Ridgepoint Police Headquarters became lively with frank and fierce dialogues. Police officers began organizing private discussions, sharing concerns and raising questions about the department's future. The collective spirit was strengthened more than ever, laying the foundation for renewal and restoring community trust. Amid these changes, Sheriff Brian Carter maintained his stance. not only as the head of a police department but as an inspiration for a new generation of officers unafraid to stand up for justice and truth. His steadfastness gradually marked an important turning point, not just in the legal battle, but in the struggle to reclaim honor and public trust. Meanwhile, the opposition weakened, with many beginning to fear their futures and fates. Pressure came not only from investigations, but also from public outrage and community demands, forcing them to rethink their past actions. The story of the opposition's collapse is not only about power and corruption exposed, but also symbolizes inevitable change, where justice and courage triumph over darkness. Ridgepoint stands at a historic crossroads, where the corrupt will find no place and the righteous will be honored. Captain Rebecca Shaw, a close ally and the most trusted companion of Sheriff Brian Carter, had shared with him countless joys, sorrows, and heavy pressures throughout their many years working together. They were not just colleagues, but fellow travelers on a rugged path, facing work challenges, external difficulties, and internal struggles side by side. That trust and bond, once formed, one of the strongest sources of strength for Brian during the toughest time. However, when the extensive investigation into the opposing faction began, Rebecca's situation changed unpredictably. Within the police department, subtle and intertwined pressures steadily increased. The leaders, powerful figures both inside the department and in external power structures, placed on her a burden she had never imagined: to testify against her teammate and closest friend, Sheriff Brian Carter. The pressure came not only through words, but also through subtle threats and silent warnings about serious consequences if she did not comply. Her career could abruptly end. Her family could become targets of unnamed pressures and difficulties, and the future she had painstakingly built could collapse in an instant. Rebecca keenly felt the growing weight of these pressures. Every time she entered the office, she carried an invisible burden that no one could share. The looks from superiors, the guiding advice masked by politeness, urgent phone calls, and continuous secret meetings left her nowhere to hide. Her mind was in constant turmoil. She thought of Brian, of the years they endured hardship together, of the trust and respect she once held for him. She thought of herself, the ideals she pursued when joining the police force, and the values she wanted to protect. But at the same time, she could not deny the truth that if she resisted this pressure, the losses she would suffer would be enormous. Each night, Rebecca tossed and turned, haunted by dreams about her current life and the choices ahead. She felt torn between duty to herself and friendship with Brian, between honesty and the harsh constraints of power. She began seeking help from those closest to her, trying to share and find a way out amid the chaos. But every door seemed closed, or only briefly ajar before shutting quickly. She realized this was not just a personal battle, but part of a much larger, more complex struggle. Gradually, Rebecca understood her choice would affect not only herself and Brian, but also the future of the police department and the public's trust in the government system. She felt this burden increasingly sharply and saw no escape. During those tense days, Rebecca tried to maintain calm outwardly and steady leadership to avoid shaking the team. But inside, she constantly wrestled with questions about loyalty, the rightness of her choice, and how to protect justice in such a complex environment. Pressure from above intensified, leaving no room for refusal or hesitation. Rebecca knew the day she would have to testify against Brian was drawing near, and though it pained her deeply and disturbed her dreams, she had to prepare to face the hardest decision of her life. Rebecca's every step grew heavier, yet she knew she could not turn back. This was the path she had chosen, even if it meant betraying her heart. Loathed, but her mind had to accept. She understood that in this battle, there was no room for weakness, only resilience and determination to see it through. As the hearing day approached, Captain Rebecca Shaw prepared for her role as a witness against Sheriff Brian Carter, the man she once regarded as an ally, her closest friend in the long fight against corruption and injustice. Every step down the police department hallway, every glance at her, seemed to record the betrayal she was about to commit, like wounds that could never heal. Rebecca knew well that her testimony would deeply wound not only Brian but also the trust and long-standing bond between them. Though instructed to remain cold and precise in her words, inside it was an indescribable pain. Every statement, every detail she presented was not merely the truth, but fragments of a friendship and loyalty tested more than once. Before the investigation board, Rebecca firmly presented the evidence prepared by her superiors, hurtful details, contradictions for which Brian was held responsible. Her voice was steady and decisive, allowing no tremor or emotion to dominate. But deep inside, she fiercely struggled between the honesty and fairness she once revered and the invisible pressures from outside. In moments unseen by others, Rebecca wondered if this betrayal was worth the price she would pay for her career, family, and herself. She could never forget the times Brian stood by and defended her during the greatest trials. Yet now they stood on opposing sides, one a friend, the other an adversary. When Brian heard that Captain Rebecca would testify against him, it felt like a knife in the back. The hurt was not only from her actions, but because he had trusted and relied on her for many years. The sense of betrayal wounded him deeply, yet he understood this battle was beyond personal. It was a struggle for justice and change he and Rebecca once dreamed of together. Despite the pain, Brian remained steadfast and calm through the hardest days. He understood Rebecca's betrayal was beyond his control, but resolved to use it as motivation to keep moving forward. He would not let psychological wounds shake his will. Instead, he transformed them into relentless fighting strength. Behind the scenes, Rebecca sometimes quietly shed tears, torn between duty and emotion. She knew she would never forget this wound, but also recognized that she needed to do what was right, regardless of right or wrong, regardless of the price. Rebecca's story of betrayal was not just a sad chapter in the lives of two people, but a testament to the challenges faced when standing at the fragile boundary between power, truth, and friendship. And it was precisely in those dark moments that justice and determination were tested and forged into strength. Brian Carter sat silently in his office as the clock struck late. Outside in the hallway, footsteps gradually thinned until they disappeared. The police building had become an empty shell, much like his own state. No one stood by him anymore. No familiar knocks from Rebecca Shaw. No small questions from Officer Doyle, no brief nods between shifts, only avoided gazes, meetings he wasn't invited to, and emails forwarded after censorship. Lately, Brian noticed his decisions were being delayed. Internal reports needing his signature were held back with reasons like under review for new approval procedures. Regional meetings listing him were postponed without explanation. Outside, D-News circulated, Sheriff Brian Carter accused of abusing authority for internal punishment. That phrase repeated on broadcasts as if someone was feeding false information to distort his public image. That evening, returning home, Brian found a note slipped under the door. No envelope, no sender's name, just a scribbled line in black marker. Stop before it's too late. Your mother is not an invincible shield. The words had no spelling errors, no capital letters at sentence start, but the style was unmistakable. A warning from those within ranks he once trusted. Brian did not react. Holding the paper between two fingertips, he went straight to the kitchen, lit the gas stove, and burned it. No tremor of fear, only an eerie silence. The flame licked the ink, the paper curled, then crumbled to ash. He returned to his workspace, opened his personal laptop, and launched a triple encrypted note-taking app. On the title, he typed, Ridge Point Journal, unedited version. He began to write down each event, every decision, every time he was ignored, every person who silently changed their attitude, not with anger or resentment, but as preparation for the worst. If I don't survive, at least someone will know. The thought appeared in his mind without typing. Even as he continued writing, he quietly repeated it many times. That night, Ridgepoint rained heavily. The wind slammed against the glass door like a reminder that the darkness outside was no longer invisible. But Brian did not know that while he sank into loneliness, someone was silently watching everything, not to harm, but to listen, a figure never revealed, who would decide the outcome in the final act. One early morning, opening his personal email, Brian was surprised to receive a message from an unexpected sender. Dr. April Denning, not a journalist, not an officer, but a sociologist, who had advised the FBI on police reform programs after the Minneapolis events. In the email, she wrote briefly but clearly, "I have been monitoring Ridgepoint's situation. Public data shows signs of irregularities. If you truly want reform, some outside the system are ready to help without delay," Brian replied immediately. They arranged a confidential call. No recording, no public platform. In that conversation, April introduced him to a network of civilian experts, independent operators outside government, but who had successfully collaborated to expose abuses of power. The group included data engineers, lawyers, behavioral psychologists, and some activists who had been wrongfully prosecuted. April said, "What you need isn't a machine fighting a machine. It's a crack for the light to shine through. We can be that crack." Brian accepted. Within 4 days, the civilian team accessed all data collected by Maria Jennings and the audit team. They did not ask about transfer procedures or whether it was legally internal. They only looked at the evidence. Using algorithmic behavioral analysis and data change tracking tools, they discovered deletion operations occurred cyclically, with patterns matching the schedules of several senior personnel. However, not everyone in the group immediately agreed. Franklin Cade, a renowned civil rights attorney, initially kept his distance from Brian. In a private meeting, he bluntly said, "I don't want to waste effort defending someone using reform as a facade." But after reviewing the secret data chain named Obsidian Loop Maria had secretly copied, his expression changed. He placed his hand on the file, paused silently for seconds, then nodded, "I will submit this to the Federal Hearing Committee." At that moment, Brian said nothing. He just clenched his fist, not out of anger or emotion, but because, for the first time in weeks of being cornered in darkness, he saw a concrete path, not through internal channels, not via the media, nor locked doors, a new path, risky but transparent. On the way back, he recalled April's words. Sometimes justice isn't in the process, but in those who dare to break it. He returned to his desk, took out an old notebook, and wrote on the first page, "I don't need the whole system. I just need a crack wide enough for the light to get through." And for the first time, he smiled, not because he had won, but because he knew he was no longer fighting alone. The morning began with an urgent call from Gwen Morales, a former secretary in the archives department. Maria Jennings had not appeared at the scheduled document review. Brian immediately checked her schedule. Her last stop was a small cafe near the western edge of town. She had met an anonymous source there. After that, there were no further traces. Her phone lost signal. The laptop was no longer synced. The neighborhood cameras accidentally corrupted the storage, 3 random points at the same time, enough for Brian to understand this was no longer an accident. Not wasting time, Brian convened an emergency contact team. Lawyer Franklin Cade agreed to join on the condition that all information be encrypted and stored outside the city's system. Elroy, a former cybersecurity officer who had worked in Chicago, flew immediately to Ridgepoint upon receiving the call. Together, they reconstructed Maria's route based on Wi-Fi data she had connected to civilian access points and remaining location data from the laptop's encryption software. "This is not an ordinary disappearance," Elroy concluded after restoring the system log sequence that had been temporarily deleted. Someone cleaned the traces, but not completely. However, during an internal meeting, Brian encountered strange indifference. An officer in the coordination team whispered, "She's not an official staff member. Acting alone means bearing the consequences." Brian stood up, placed both hands on the table, his voice low but firm. "She did what you all dared not do. She is one of mine." No one said another word. Maria's laptop signal was last traced to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the industrial zone, a property formerly owned by a bankrupt logistics company, but mentioned in Jason Cargill's files. Brian's team immediately headed there. Maria was not present, but they found a familiar jacket, neatly folded and left on a broken bench. Inside the pocket was a torn piece of paper from an internal email printout, with a scrawled, handwritten line. "Obsidian is not enough to save you." A chill ran down Brian's spine. He understood the message. Obsidian Loop, the file Maria had found containing all emails directing internal media manipulation, had been discovered by someone else. And now, Maria was a hostage of secrets that had yet to be revealed. As night fell, Brian returned to his office and typed a single line on his personal server, encrypting and sending it to all who had promised not to stand idle. "This is no longer an investigation. This is a rescue mission." He knew that to bring Maria back, he would have to confront not only Jason Cargill, but an entire system that traded silence for power. Since Maria's disappearance, Brian no longer trusted any procedure within the system. Together with a civilian alliance led by lawyer Franklin Cade and engineer Elroy, they formed a special task force, bypassing the police department and avoiding record-keeping. Cade immediately sent an urgent request to the Federal Investigation Office, citing a federal collaborator missing while investigating organized corruption in Ridgepoint. In the document, he did not name Maria, only using an interagency identification code. Every word was cautious, because he knew if the enemy knew what they held, the game would end at the desk. Elroy traced the signal from the anti-tracking USB device Maria always carried. This device was designed to emit a signal only when the user activated emergency mode. After hours of tracking repeated frequencies, Elroy found a shaky signal lasting 17 minutes. Located 8 miles north of town, near the abandoned industrial area where GPS signals were often distorted by thick metal barriers. They did not wait for orders. Brian assembled a team of 4. Himself, Elroy, a former officer named Laird who had left the force out of frustration, and a locksmith expert who once worked for the FBI but now operated in the civilian sector. They wore no uniforms, carried no badges. They were nameless, people who no longer believed in authority but carried a moral mandate. The industrial zone lay in ruins like a ghost. Brian and his team found a pallet-covered stairway leading to a basement. Below was a steel door, locked from the outside but showing signs of forced entry. Inside the low-ceilinged, damp room, they found no Maria. But 3 things tightened Brian's heart: a wall-mounted camera aimed at the center of the room, a torn piece of paper listing code names of personnel who had opposed policies within the system, and a portable hard drive manually labeled OBS_backup_1. Laird turned to Elroy. "Either it's a trap, or it's the last thing she managed to leave behind." Brian said nothing. He approached to inspect the steel door. The handle bore a dried red streak. Laird used his blood sampling kit. The device quickly showed the result on a mobile screen. The blood matched Maria Jennings' DNA. But the blood was not from a struggle. It was carefully dripped right on the handle, exactly where someone attentive would notice. Like a sign, a message. "She's alive," Brian said softly, "and she's fighting her own way." On the way back, no one spoke. They knew time was not on their side, but now they had clues, had passed the first veil of fog, and though darkness still surrounded them, the faint light of dried blood streaks, the paper with code names, and the hard drive of unknown content was enough for this nameless group to move forward. Brian sat alone in the small office, the fluorescent light from the ceiling casting a cold glow, reflecting off the piles of documents spread across the desk. A heavy atmosphere enveloped the room, making every breath he took feel labored. Each time he looked at those pages, a chaotic mixture of helplessness and determination welled up inside him. Maria Jennings, the loyal companion, the only colleague he could trust, was now mysteriously missing. The fear for her safety left Brian unable to find peace. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, like a countdown to an inevitable event. Brian placed his hand on his forehead, trying to focus, but his mind drifted back to the times working with Maria, to their secret conversations preparing for the escalating battle against corruption in the Ridgepoint Police Department. Suddenly, the phone vibrated, startling him. Brian quickly grabbed the device. On the screen appeared an encrypted message from Maria, sent from an unknown number not saved in his contacts. A rush of anxiety took hold as he opened the message. It contained a set of documents and meticulously encrypted audio recordings, the evidence Maria had secretly collected over time. These materials included internal reports, emails, text messages, and even photos of clandestine meetings. The recordings captured calculated conversations among police leadership and shadowy interest groups. There were also confessions and carefully documented conspiracies to cover up crimes, irrefutable in nature. Brian was speechless, a mixture of fear and excitement flooding him. This was not only proof to expose the truth, but also Maria's final gift to him before disappearing. This evidence would become the strongest weapon to fight traitors within, those who abused power to manipulate and harm the community. He sighed deeply, his gaze sharpening. All the tension, fatigue, and pressure seemed replaced by a new hope, a hope for justice, for truth to be revealed. Brian knew well that with this evidence, he was no longer alone on the arduous path ahead. He opened his computer, beginning to carefully sort and analyze each document. Every detail, no matter how small, could be a vital link to unraveling the deep-rooted corruption infiltrating Ridgepoint Police. Brian spent hours without rest, repeatedly listening to the recordings, thoroughly reading reports and verifying information. In his mind, Maria's image appeared vividly, a courageous woman, dedicated to her work, willing to sacrifice everything to protect the truth. Brian knew he had to continue this fight, not only for himself, but also for Maria and the citizens of Ridgepoint, who longed for justice. The evidence Maria sent not only revealed wrongdoing, but also illuminated the deep roots of corruption in the system. From opaque funds, hidden meetings, to cover-ups and abuse of power, everything was exposed to light. Brian felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders heavier than ever. In a moment, he stood and walked to the window, gazing down at the peaceful street below. The evening sky was turning gray, signaling an approaching storm. Brian sensed that he too stood at the threshold of his own storm, the greatest challenge of his life. But this time, he was not alone. Maria had left him a path, a weapon, and an undeniable truth. Brian silently vowed he would not let her sacrifice be in vain. The truth must be revealed. Justice must be served. Brian's eyes grew more determined than ever. His battle had just begun, and now, with these documents in hand, he had the chance to completely change the situation, to bring those who abused power into the light, and to protect the values he had vowed to uphold since becoming sheriff. Sitting upright in the worn chair in the small office, Brian wore his headset, eyes fixed on the computer screen. Each audio clip played like vivid pieces, exposing the dark secrets hidden within Ridgepoint Police. The voices of officers he once trusted now echoed with secret deals, dark conspiracies to conceal misconduct and maintain personal power. Secret calls between Jason Cargill and allies were not mere exchanges of information, but discussions planning to suppress whistleblowers, silence accusers, and manipulate the legal system. Brian noted every minor detail, every name mentioned, every location discussed, knowing these would be the foundational bricks to construct a comprehensive picture of deep corruption. Covert meetings, recorded through hidden devices, revealed long-standing tolerance and cover-ups within the department. Top commanders not only ignored but actively aided wrongful acts. Suspicious funds and shady ties between police and local criminal groups became clear in every word and mocking laugh. Brian felt anger rising, but maintained absolute calm. This was not the time to lose control, but to plan, using every piece of evidence, every recording, to present an undeniable case case to the public and law enforcement. Maria's documents also included hidden internal reports and correspondence between police leadership and outside organizations, exposing budget misuse and deliberate neglect of abuse and racial discrimination cases. Brian shuddered, realizing the complexity and scale of this network. He reminded himself this was not just his fight, but that of the Ridgepoint community, people yearning for a clean justice system with no place for greed and abuse of power. With that determination, Brian began drafting a detailed summary report. Preparing for the upcoming hearing, he understood that to win, thorough preparation was essential, making it impossible for anyone to deny the truth. Yet Brian also knew that once exposed, opposition reactions would be fierce. They would not quietly accept defeat. Threats would grow, dangers could lurk anywhere. However, this time he was no longer alone. Support from the community and honest officers was increasing, forming an unbreakable united force. The battle against corruption in Ridgepoint had begun to shift. From a deeply rooted, hidden system, shadows were pulled into the light and crimes were revealed layer by layer. Brian's heart beat faster from pressure, but also hope. He knew the road ahead was long and challenging, but this was a crucial turning point, a turning point that could change the fate of the entire town. With evidence in hand and faith in justice, Brian prepared for the most decisive phase of his life and career. In a quiet moment, Brian looked out the window, where city lights began to glow. Those small lights were like flames of hope, small but enough to guide the way and dispel darkness. He knew he must do everything for that flame, for the people of Ridgepoint, and for himself. Brian stepped through the heavy door of the hearing room, each footstep echoing clearly against the cold stone floor. All eyes turned to him, gazes mingled with curiosity, doubt, even hostility. The air inside was suffocatingly tense, the harsh fluorescent light illuminating a variety of faces. Government officials, lawyers, journalists, and on the front row, the opposition, their expressions icy and calculating. Jason Cargyle, Brian's direct adversary, sat upright, his sharp eyes scrutinizing every gesture and word, seeking any sign of weakness. His face betrayed contempt, as if ready to unleash new tactics to derail the truth. He had led the conspiracy for years, and now, confronted with irrefutable evidence, the tension on his face only grew more pronounced. Brian felt the pressure of those probing looks, the whispered asides, the subtle maneuvers unfolding in the room. Yet his resolve remained unshaken. He had prepared for this day long ago. Every document, every recording meticulously verified for absolute authenticity. When called to testify, Brian approached the podium, his gaze sweeping the room, pausing briefly on each witness and committee member to command attention and earn trust. His voice rang out clear and confident, yet tinged with emotion, conveying his determination and sincerity. I stand here not only to defend my own honor, but for justice, for the community of Ridgepoint that has endured abuse of power and injustice for far too long. He began presenting the evidence Maria Jennings had sent in before disappearing. First came an audio recording played in the room, the hoarse voice of a senior officer discussing how to conceal brutality and corruption within the police department. The room fell instantly silent, tension peaking. Next came detailed budget reports showing misappropriated funds, and minutes of secret meetings planning how to thwart independent investigations. Brian argued that this evidence was not speculation or a baseless accusation, but a clear, undeniable truth. As further recordings played, murmurs and varied reactions spread through the room. Some tried to hide their shock, others glanced around sheepishly, while the opposition grew visibly agitated, their eyes hardening. But Brian remained calm and composed. For a moment he paused, allowing everyone time to absorb the information. Then he continued, "We cannot ignore these facts any longer. If we fail to act now, we will allow those who abuse power to continue manipulating the system and harming our community." His conviction resonated like a force. Supporters began nodding and exchanging approving looks, while the opposition visibly shifted. calculating their next move to counter his claims. Brian closed his initial testimony with a compelling message. Justice is not some distant ideal. It begins with us, with the courage to stand for truth and fairness. I hope today's hearing will mark the turning point that returns Ridgepoint to the light it deserves. Silence reigned for a long moment before quiet applause rose from his supporters. The truth had begun to emerge, and the battle against corruption in Ridgepoint's police department moved into its decisive phase. As Brian finished, Jason Cargill rose, his gaze as cold as steel, addressing the room defiantly. What you've presented is nothing but vague evidence, one-sided interpretations. There's no proof. You're not wielding power for personal revenge. The opposition launched every tactic, presenting forged documents, dishonest testimonies, even leveraging connections to intimidate witnesses. The hearing quickly turned into a high-stakes intellectual battle. Brian did not flinch. He had faced worse challenges and knew every trick the opponents might use. His words were deliberate and precise, dismantling their distortions and exposing the lies. He explained the authenticity of the recordings, the coherent linkage of evidence, and the consistency of honest witnesses' statements. He posed pointed questions that left the opposition flustered and off balance. Support for Brian grew stronger among committee members and outside witnesses alike. Everyone seemed to glimpse the emerging truth, the light exposing the once untouchable shadows. The debate grew increasingly fierce, with personal attacks and denial schemes. Yet Brian maintained his composure and leadership. He understood this fight was not just for himself, but for the future of all Ridgepoint. As the hearing neared its end, Brian took a final moment to emphasize, "We have a duty to protect justice, to uphold the values Ridgepoint deserves. The truth cannot remain buried forever, and today we must courageously stand to defend it." His words echoed through the room, unleashing an undeniable power. The opposition fell silent, their eyes beginning worry and anger. A change was beginning, and Brian knew he had crossed the most critical threshold in this battle. Captain Rebecca Shaw stood in the small room where light filtered through a dusty white-painted window. Her hand trembled as she held the thick dossier she had compiled and studied for weeks. Inside her mind, regret tangled with anxiety and a deep-seated fear, not only of the consequences ahead, but of her own actions. Rebecca had once been Brian Carter's most loyal ally, his closest friend, and most trusted colleague. They had shared countless joys, sorrows, and unspoken pressures in their battle against corruption and injustice. She had stood by him in his darkest hours, understood his unwavering determination and commitment to fairness, yet when pressure from above intensified, threats and warnings arriving in rapid succession, she faced an impossible choice: testify against Brian at the upcoming hearing. This betrayal was not what she wanted, but she believed it was the only way to protect herself, her family, and the career she had worked so hard to build. Each day weighed heavily on her. She forced a brave facade and carried on as if nothing had changed, but inside she was torn by unanswerable questions. Was this the right thing to do? Had she broken her own code of trust? Could Brian ever forgive her? Many nights she lay awake, her mind spinning with memories of the past. She recalled Brian defending and encouraging her when she struggled. She remembered planning operations together, facing danger and overcoming every obstacle. That trust now felt like a wound that bled a little more each day. Superiors ramped up the pressure, not only with words but with actions. Secret meetings, late-night calls, blunt warnings about the price of refusal left Rebecca on the brink of collapse. She felt trapped between powerful forces, unable to escape or fight back. One gloomy afternoon, Rebecca stared into her own tired eyes in the precinct bathroom mirror. She wondered if she could endure any more or if she needed another way out. Yet she knew that whatever she chose, painful consequences awaited. Amid that tension, A spark ignited when she saw Brian's steadfast resolve. Despite her betrayal, he kept fighting for justice with optimism intact. That image shook Rebecca awake, reminding her she could not live forever in fear and betrayal. At last, she resolved to rise up, correct her mistakes, and commit herself to the truth. Though she knew the price would be high, she saw no alternative but to do what was right. The day before the hearing, Rebecca quietly met Brian in a discreet room. Tears welled in her eyes, her voice trembling but resolute. "Brian, I'm sorry. I did wrong. I can't stay silent any longer. I will stand for truth and justice." Brian looked at her with surprise and emotion. He understood that this reversal was the turning point in their struggle. Rebecca's return became the final beacon of hope in the case's dark night. From then on, Rebecca prepared to rejoin the fight with courage and conviction, ready for every challenge, every doubtful glance, and every rumor that might follow her testimony, determined to help restore justice. On the day of the hearing, she walked in heavy-hearted yet determined, each step echoing on the cold tile floor like the coming revelation of truth. All eyes turned to her, a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Her duty was more than testimony. It was the responsibility to change the fate of a fractured institution. Her voice rang clear and measured, each word chosen carefully, betraying no hesitation or defeat. She recounted everything she had witnessed: secret meetings, unlawful directives, and cover-ups she had once been forced to conceal. Each statement struck like an arrow into the deceit shielding the corrupt faction, gradually lifting the veil of darkness. The audience listened intently, many visibly moved by her honesty and bravery. Rebecca's integrity and remorse became a symbol of renewed faith and hope. She not only revealed the truth, but also conveyed deep regret, drawing empathy and understanding from all who heard. The corrupt faction tried to discredit her, spinning arguments to undermine her credibility, but they could not deny the power of her evidence. Documents, emails, and recordings, presented convincingly, transformed the hearing room from tension to stunned silence. As soon as Rebecca concluded, other witnesses gained courage, stepping forward with fresh information and new evidence. Voices long suppressed now rose in unison, forming an unstoppable wave against corruption. Brian watched with renewed confidence in his eyes. Rebecca's comeback delivered a powerful jolt, reinvigorating him and the team. They knew this was the decisive moment, the turning point to bring truth to light and reclaim justice for their community. Rebecca's courage not only weakened the corrupt faction's hold, but also inspired others inside and outside the department. She became a symbol of change, awakening those who had once remained silent in fear. The hearing continued amid strong public and media responses. News reports and interviews amplified the impact, increasing pressure on the remaining corrupt elements. Community support fueled the push for reform and transparency. Post-hearing, Rebecca faced new challenges: suspicious glances, rumors, and skepticism from colleagues still loyal to the corrupt faction. Yet she stood firm, undeterred, in spirit and determination. Each day she collaborated with Brian and the team to finalize the case, bolster evidence, and prepare for next steps. Their unwavering resolve and persistence brought them closer to the ultimate victory. Through this ordeal, Rebecca learned invaluable lessons about the power of truth, courage, and perseverance. She understood that although the cost might be steep, honesty and righteousness are the only paths to justice. Her transformation marked a profound turning point, not only in the investigation, but also in her personal life, helping her rediscover herself and rebuild her lost faith. Rebecca became a shining example for anyone determined to fight for justice against overwhelming odds. In the end, the hearing closed in an atmosphere both solemn and hopeful. The efforts of Rebecca, Brian, and their team yielded initial results, opening the door to a cleaner, fairer Ridgepoint. Thus began the story of awakening and triumph of truth, the first step on the long journey ahead, one they would never walk alone. Jason Cargill was once considered one of the most powerful and influential figures in the Ridgepoint Police Department. He ran everything with near absolute confidence, building a discreet but extremely tight network of power where those who disobeyed were swiftly and mercilessly eliminated. However, as internal investigations expanded with the involvement of external law enforcement agencies, the veil of secrecy gradually lifted, and things slipped out of Jason's control. Pieces of the case were meticulously assembled by investigators, creating a panoramic picture of corruption, fraud, and abuse of power. Secret recorded calls, encrypted messages, unusual financial transactions, and evidence of staged, fabricated proofs all revealed Jason's sophisticated and systematic manipulation. It wasn't just one individual, but a network of associates and allies inside the department who cooperated to maintain power and cover up serious violations. The truth's exposure caused many within the police department to awaken. Those who had been pressured into silence, colleagues once involved or aware of Jason's misconduct, could no longer endure the lies and injustice. They began providing additional information and presenting new evidence to clarify the truth. The collective unity and coordination generated strong pressure, making it increasingly difficult for the opposition faction to cling on. The police community and Ridgepoint residents, who once saw Jason as an unshakable symbol of power, began to see the true person behind the mask. The image of a corrupt figure exploiting his position for personal gain, covering up wrongdoing, and severely damaging public trust was gradually revealed. The deeply wounded trust stirred public outrage, creating a powerful wave of opposition. Public and legal pressure on Jason grew daily. His calls and messages began to be monitored. His powerful connections tightened and squeezed. Jason became tense and panicked in his final efforts to conceal the truth and protect his throne. He employed every tactic, from bribery and intimidation to interfering with investigations, but these efforts gradually became meaningless as authorities became more resolute and transparent. Moreover, Jason's close allies began to withdraw. They did not want to be caught in the scandal's vortex or face legal punishment. The collapse of the power network gradually left Jason isolated, under constant judgment and criticism from colleagues, the public, and the media. The atmosphere in the police department shifted dramatically. Respect and caution gave way to suspicion and wariness. Every hallway and corner of the department grew tense and suffocating, as if everyone awaited the final moment for someone who once stood at the pinnacle of power. Jason Cargill was no longer an untouchable symbol, but had become an emblem of collapse and failure. This event marked a historic turning point for the Ridgepoint Police Department, opening the door for profound change and reform to rebuild trust and justice. Now, all eyes turned to those standing against injustice, with Brian Carter as the steadfast and determined symbol. And in Jason's darkest moment, the light of justice began to dawn, guiding Ridgepoint toward a new future, where power would no longer be a tool for oppression, but a means to protect justice and the people. After Jason Cargill was exposed as the mastermind behind the corruption and abuse network, a huge wave of consequences followed, causing the entire opposition faction to collapse one by one. They had nowhere to hide and could no longer deny the wrongdoings they had caused to the department and community. Individuals who had abused their positions to manipulate and conceal the truth were thoroughly investigated. Disciplinary hearings proceeded swiftly, followed by dismissals, demotions, and criminal prosecutions. Many lost everything: reputation, career, even freedom, as the law closed its circle of punishment. The community gradually regained trust, witnessing the law's rigor and the new leadership's determination. Public meetings, transparent reporting, and the establishment of civilian oversight councils allowed citizens to directly monitor and participate in supervising police activities. These changes not only altered appearances, but transformed work culture, strengthened accountability, and enhanced professional ethics. Jason Cargill, once the powerful head of the corruption network, has now become a symbol of downfall. He was completely isolated, publicly judged, and faced trials to answer for his misconduct. This event was not only a costly lesson for him, but also a warning for anyone daring to abuse power for personal gain. For the Ridgepoint Police Department, this was a major turning point, marking the start of a new era where transparency, fairness, and respect for human rights became firm foundations. Reform efforts helped restore reputation and expand community trust, creating a healthier and more effective working environment. Brian Carter and his team continued their persistent long-term reform plans, emphasizing regular training, strict supervision, and building an early warning system to prevent recurring misconduct. Transparency and community involvement became guiding principles in all department activities. The story of the opposition's downfall became a symbol of the power of truth and courage. It was not only a victory for Brian and his teammates, but also proof of a fairer society where justice is always enforced and corruption finds no refuge. Ridgepoint began writing a new chapter in its history, a chapter of hope and recovery. The city's people felt positive changes, beginning to trust again those who protect them, the legal system, and ethical values, once shaken. Under the light of transparency and justice, corrupt shadows gradually vanished, paving the way for a better future for everyone. This victory belonged not only to Brian Carter, but to the entire Ridgepoint community, a worthy triumph built on perseverance, courage, and relentless will. The official hearing took place in a tense atmosphere, drawing significant attention from both the police community and the citizens of Ridgepoint. Brian Carter, who had been entangled in false accusations and reputational damage, now stood before his last chance to clear his name. Every detail in the case file, every piece of evidence presented by the lawyers, was clear, sharp, and irrefutable. The baseless charges were gradually dismissed, while the evidence supporting Brian was widely publicized, delivering a powerful boost that helped him regain his status and the trust of both the public and his colleagues. This event not only helped Brian erase the long-standing misunderstandings, but also reinforced his leadership position within the police department. Doubtful glances and rumors gradually gave way to respect and confidence. Brian was not only the victor of the hearing, but also a symbol of justice and perseverance in the fight against corruption. The response from the local community and police officers was overwhelmingly positive. Citizens began to show strong support for Brian, with many openly defending and encouraging him. A spirit of unity was rekindled among the people, creating a strong bond between the police force and the community. Meetings and exchanges between Brian and community groups were held regularly, fostering a close, friendly, and transparent environment where everyone could express their concerns, offer suggestions, and work together to build a safer environment. For police officers who had once doubted Brian, their attitudes gradually shifted after witnessing the transparency and fairness of the investigation. Hidden barriers began to break down, opening the way for cooperation with the new leadership. Brian focused on building a police team with high responsibility, honesty, and dedication to their work, thus laying the foundation for profound change. To restore trust within the department, Brian concentrated on establishing effective internal communication programs. He organized regular meetings, providing opportunities for officers to share difficulties, discuss issues, and propose solutions. At the same time, training courses on professional ethics, public duty responsibility, and communication skills were seriously implemented, enhancing awareness and service attitude at the individual level. Transparent policies were publicly disclosed to ensure everyone could clearly and fairly monitor the police department's activities. Brian established an open feedback channel allowing citizens and officers to send opinions, report issues, or suggest improvements. This not only helped detect potential problems early, but also built trust between the public and the police force. However, the journey to restore trust was not always smooth. Brian faced silent opposition from old interest groups still lurking within the department. They attempted to hinder and sabotage reform plans, maintaining outdated habits despite the common good. In these situations, Brian demonstrated decisiveness in handling issues while skillfully building consensus with the majority of well-intentioned staff. He knew that changing work culture required not only firm decisions but also building internal consensus. Brian frequently met and listened to individual opinions, shared his vision and common goals, thereby creating a healthy, open, and mutually respectful work environment. The initial phase of recovery brought encouraging results. Trust, once damaged, was gradually healed, and a new spirit began to spread within the Ridgepoint Police Department. Brian understood there was still much to do ahead, but with perseverance and dedication, he believed he and his team would steer the department in the right direction, worthy of the community's and their own trust. Brian embarked on the police reform with strong determination and a clear vision to build a fairer, more transparent and effective organization. First, he focused on implementing periodic training programs for all officers and staff. These courses not only provided professional knowledge, but also emphasized professional ethics, public duty responsibility, communication skills, and handling sensitive situations. Brian invited independent experts and reputable social organizations to participate in teaching, ensuring objectivity and training quality. Simultaneously, Brian accelerated upgrading the surveillance system with modern technology. All work areas and public points related to police activities were equipped with monitoring cameras, recording all behaviors to enhance transparency and accountability. This system also served internal supervision and timely violation handling. Furthermore, Brian and the leadership established a civilian oversight council with real authority to evaluate and reflect on the police department's activities. The council included community representatives, legal experts, and social activists, creating an important bridge between the police and citizens. The council's presence not only helped reduce abuse of power, but also increased community trust and support for the police force. Complaint handling procedures were thoroughly improved. Brian built a mechanism for fast, transparent reception of reports, while strictly protecting whistleblowers' rights. Clear and public processing steps ensured every complaint was fairly reviewed and resolved. At the same time, he focused on strengthening communication, so the public understood their rights and how to participate in oversight. Alongside technical and legal policies, Brian also concentrated on restoring organizational culture. He built an open, respectful, and united working environment by organizing group activities, encouraging staff to share opinions and cooperate effectively. Regular group meetings, soft skill training, and community events were held to enhance responsibility and team cohesion. To ensure sustainability and reform, Brian established a transparent performance evaluation system and continuously adjusted policies based on practical feedback. Periodic reports were publicly disclosed so officers and the community could monitor progress. He also developed a long-term development strategy, aiming not only to solve immediate problems, but also to create fundamental and lasting change. Thanks to determination and methodical steps, the Ridgepoint Police Department gradually regained trust and reestablished its position in the public's heart. Every small change created a positive ripple effect within the community and team. Brian was not only a leader, but also a symbol of renewal and hope. The reform process inevitably faced difficulties. Opposition from individuals and remaining interest groups still existed. But with growing support from outside and inside, Brian persevered through challenges, maintaining a vision of a clean, effective, and respected police department. These steps opened a new chapter for Ridgepoint, a place where justice is not merely a promise but a reality, where the police force accompanies and serves for the benefit of every citizen. From these relentless efforts, a bright future awaits, full of promise and opportunities to build a fairer and safer society for all. Brian Carter stood before the large auditorium, ceiling lights shining down on every attentive face. This was no ordinary meeting, but the start of a new chapter, a training class for the entire Ridgepoint County Police Force, focusing on respect for human rights and awareness of official responsibility. Officers present, from seasoned veterans to young recruits donning their uniforms for the first time, all knew this event marked a historic milestone, signaling profound culture. Brian began his speech with a steady yet emotional voice. He shared his personal story, the challenging months when his mother was insulted inside the police station, the loneliness and pain facing betrayals within the force, and relentless efforts to restore justice and trust. His sincere words struck deeply, silencing the hall. People not only listened but felt the determination and resilience of their leader. The training content was carefully developed, including lessons on racial discrimination, a painful issue that once fractured the community. Brian emphasized that police were not just law enforcers but also guardians of social justice, respecting diversity and individual dignity. Skills for interacting with diverse communities, conflict management, and effective communication were integrated, using real scenarios to help officers better understand public feelings and responses. At first, many officers were cautious. Accustomed to old, sometimes rigid and harsh methods, they were unfamiliar with new thinking about human rights and respect for differences. But through each session, lively discussions and simulations, change gradually emerged. Doubtful eyes shifted to understanding looks, and challenging questions turned into constructive suggestions. More than a class, it became a forum for officers to share thoughts, express work difficulties, and listen to each other. Brian confidently stood among them, acting as a connector, guide, and inspiration for deeper self-reflection. The event attracted attention from local communities and human rights organizations. Representatives from social groups, local leaders, and even some media figures attended, showing support and hope for Ridgepoint Police transformation. They recognized it was not merely training, but a stepping stone to rebuild the fractured trust between police and community. Some young officers showed eagerness and long-term commitment, seeing it as a chance to change themselves and reshape public perception of the police. They expressed a desire to become bridges between police and citizens, breaking prejudices and fostering a respectful, harmonious work environment. At the end of the first training session, Brian silently watched his teammates leave. Hope and determination shone in his eyes. The road ahead was long and challenging, but today's step was a sign of irreversible change. He knew that for a town like Ridgepoint to truly enter a new era, free from racial discrimination and abuse of power, where all are treated fairly and respectfully, it required not just training but deep transformation within each person's mindset, and he was ready to lead that journey with all his perseverance and integrity. Brian Carter stood on a small stage in Ridgepoint's central square, facing hundreds of attentive citizens. The gentle morning air and soft sunlight created a rare peaceful scene after months of turmoil. It was not just a meeting, but the official launch of a new era, an era without racial bias or abuse of authority in the local police force. Starting from internal training classes, changes rapidly spread throughout the town. Brian and his colleagues tirelessly promoted reform policies, beginning with establishing a more transparent monitoring system. Cameras were installed everywhere, from police headquarters to patrol points, recording all actions to ensure fairness and transparency. The footage could not be altered or hidden, creating a protective layer for both police and public. The complaint handling process was also significantly improved. Citizens could now submit reports via multiple channels, from support centers to mobile apps. Feedback was handled promptly and seriously, rebuilding trust in the once fractured community. Notably, a civilian oversight council was formed with diverse participants, from social activists, teachers, business people, to religious leaders. This council acted as an intermediary to supervise police activities and safeguard citizens' rights. Community involvement not only increased transparency, but also fostered a positive dialogue environment where every voice was heard. People gradually noticed clear differences in how police interacted with them. Instead of defensive and suspicious attitudes, officers now proactively approached, listened, and resolved issues humanely. Cases were handled quickly and fairly, free from old prejudices that had damaged community trust. Simultaneously, social organizations, schools, and local businesses collaborated closely with police to organize various activities promoting equality and mutual respect. Workshops, extracurricular programs, and community projects were widely implemented, creating a connected and united town atmosphere. Brian emerged as a symbol of change, not just a police leader, but an inspiration to the community. He earned respect not only for his role, but for his steadfastness, integrity, and responsibility toward justice and human rights. Long-term plans continued under Bryan's leadership to strengthen the Justice Foundation, continuously improve public services, and train staff. He understood change was not a one-day achievement, but a long journey requiring everyone's contribution. The sunrise over Ridge Point cast light on rooftops, streets, and hopeful faces. The scene symbolized a new beginning, a bright era where justice and compassion would always be guiding flames, ensuring past sufferings never recur. Some stories don't need a spectacular ending to leave people speechless. Some battles don't require gunfire, but still leave wounds in the hearts of those who witness them. And some characters, like Mrs. Samuth Carter, Sheriff Bryan Carter, or Maria Jennings, aren't heroes in the headlines, but symbols of courage, those who dare to stand in the darkness while others turn away. From a splash of water in the police headquarters lobby, to a reform quietly resisted, to the disappearance of the only woman brave enough to touch a rotten system. This story is not simply about solving a case or punishing evil. It is a mirror reflecting society where prejudice, power, and fear coexist alongside hope, justice, and trust. Lesson 1. Don't judge others hastily just because they are different. Mrs. Samatha, a senior mother without power or position, was scolded and insulted by a young officer simply because she stood in the wrong place in his eyes. What Victor Cargyle didn't know was that she was the mother of the sheriff trying to do what was right. His insult not only hurt a person, but it exposed a terrible mindset silently existing within the civil service, judging a person at first glance. Lesson 2. Talent and human value cannot be underestimated just because someone is not part of the strong faction. Maria Jennings was once fired, threatened with death, and stripped of investigation privileges, but she did not stay silent. She came back, quietly re-examined files, pieced together the truth, and became the only person able to expose the hidden protection network in the force. She did not need recognition from the system. She only needed a just cause and a partner willing to walk with her, and that was enough to change the situation. Lesson 3. Justice always finds a way to win, even if it must go around, even if it takes time. Bryan Carter was betrayed, isolated, threatened. Those who sat beside him in meetings gradually fell silent or turned away, but he did not give up. He did not trade principles to keep the sheriff's seat. He chose to move forward, to seek allies outside, to let light shine through the smallest cracks of the system. And in the end, he was no longer alone. This story is proof of a simple yet difficult truth in real life. Believe in what is right, even when the whole world tells you to quit. Ask yourself, have you ever been misjudged simply because someone didn't understand you? Have you ever been underestimated but quietly proved yourself better than they thought? If your answer is yes, you are not alone. This story is for you, for those who have ever felt small in a vast system, oppressed, wanting to scream but swallowing their tears. You don't need to be a sheriff to demand justice. You don't need to be a journalist to expose the truth. You only need to hold on to one thing: never stay silent when witnessing wrong. We live in a society where people are easily judged by appearances, where reputation sometimes hides dignity, and where truth is often distorted by those in power. But if enough people believe in, protect, and share the truth, justice will no longer be distant. If this story makes you think, share it so more can learn from it. Let your voice be the first echo reaching someone who needs a spark of hope. And don't forget, subscribe to the channel to follow more inspiring stories, because every story can be a spark, and every listener can be the light.